Let's open in prayer. Eternal and gracious Father, how thankful we are for this time that we can come together for our last lesson on the life of Christ and the land of Israel. We do pray that as we go through some of these things, you'll help us to understand the relevance of some of the modern things that we see and how this modern state of Israel came into being. So we commit ourselves to your care. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so we're taking a look at the early church to present day. We are basically covering almost 2,000 years of history, in one lesson here. And this really concerns the land of Israel, okay? Because when we go, we will be going to Israel. But current-day Israel did not exist until 1948, because since 70 AD, it was not a nation of its own. So we'll be taking a look at some of these things, and we want to look at it especially in light of what Christ is doing in building his church. Because one of the things that we will be doing is we will be visiting a church in Israel where we will be worshiping. The late pastor was a classmate of the late Pastor Thomas Chong of PRPC. And for those of you who have like BP connections, he attended a lecture by the late Dr. Timothy Toe. So this pastor was my friend, and he's pastoring a Reformed Baptist church in Jerusalem until the Lord took him home a number of years ago when he was tracting and witnessing in Syria and in Iraq. So the church continues today as a witness, and they minister the gospel every Friday, when they go up to Tel Aviv to do tracting, to the secular Jews as well as to, people internationally. And so every time we would go there, we would bring tracts and Bibles in Chinese, so that when we go up to Tel Aviv, and we manage to speak to people, we would hand out some of these tracts. So, we're looking at modern-day Israel, in our deliberations today. And so part of the things we'll cover would be what happened since the ascension of Jesus. We'll look very quickly at the Acts of the Apostles following the destruction of Jerusalem. Then the early Christian era in Israel, in Palestine. Then subsequently the Islamic conquest, the British rule and modern state of Israel, and finally mission to the Jews. So this gives you some context. When you go there, you're not just looking at the ruins, you're not just looking at this site and that site, but why in the world is there a church here? Why is it built in, Eastern Orthodox style? Why are there monks and nuns going around the streets of Jerusalem? So this lesson, we hope to bring into perspective some of these things. Now, after Jesus ascended, we know that he had commissioned the apostles to return back to Jerusalem, that they would pray and wait for the Spirit, and thereafter they would be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, in Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. And as we go through today's lesson, we're actually seeing how the gospel had spread, how there was a decline, in Christianity. How come the birthplace of Jesus, where the gospel was in Jerusalem, why is it that majority of the people there do not believe today? All right, so yet they were called to be these witnesses, right? Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. Now, a week later, the Spirit did come, and the apostles were witnesses. They preached the gospel in all different kinds of languages, the languages that the Jews themselves spoke, being from different parts of the world. And after they heard the gospel, they believed. The church grew exponentially. In one day, the church grew from 120 disciples to 3,120 disciples. And as the gospel was continued to be propagated, the church grew so much so that within a few months, it was like 10,000 in number. And what happened is, by the time Acts 8 came, there was persecution. The Jewish leaders who had crucified Jesus, they were shocked that this could happen, and so they set out to persecute and to arrest the Christians. And because of that, the church was scattered. They had remained in Jerusalem, all 3,120, all subsequently 10,000 of them. In order to fulfill the Great Commission of Jesus, persecution came, and the church was scattered to Judea and Samaria. And even the Ethiopian eunuch believed, and he was returning home to, South Sudan, right? To that place where the queen, the Candake, was, and he would be a witness. So not only would the gospel go as far as Judea and Samaria, but it was now traveling to Africa. Then in Acts 9, Saul was converted, the one who wanted to persecute the church. God used the chief enemy of the church to be the chief propagator of the gospel. And from there, the Gentiles heard the gospel and they believed. We see in Acts 10 and 11 and so forth, Peter preached the gospel to Cornelius. And the gospel went not only to Ethiopia, but now a Roman believed the gospel. So it was going to the ends of the earth. Now, here before us is a map just to show you when the people, the Jews came for Pentecost, they came from all of these areas: Mede, Parthia, Elam, Arabia, Cyrene, all here. And they came out to Jerusalem at Pentecost. They heard and they believed. And because of the persecution, they were dispersed. Now, many of them returned back home. So not only did the gospel go to Samaria and Judea, Ethiopia, but it went to the uttermost parts of the earth by these converts themselves. Now, Saul, of course, had been converted. And after his conversion, he almost immediately started preaching. Now, he went on his first missionary journey. Remember that God had already called him to be a missionary to the Gentiles, right? That was his primary calling, and that he would suffer many things for Jesus. Now, the first missionary journey, Paul went from Antioch only to this region of Pamphylia, Galatia, right, and Cilicia, where he was from. But already, all of the Gentiles who heard. Now, remember when Paul first went, he went to the synagogues because, according to Romans 1:16, the gospel is first for the Jews and then thereafter for the Gentiles. So everywhere he went first to the synagogues, and when he was kicked out of the synagogues, he went to the Gentiles. So here, the Gentiles started believing, and word came back to Jerusalem, hey, they're Gentiles who are believing. What are we going to do with them? Should they be circumcised? Should they observe the law of Moses? And in the Jerusalem council, it was decided that Gentiles, they received the Spirit before they were circumcised. So circumcision has nothing to do with that, right? And so if they are brought into the kingdom by the Spirit, they do not need to be circumcised. They do not need to partake of the ceremonial laws and to abstain from the dietary restrictions of the Jews. And so Jews and Gentiles were now in the church fulfilling, what Jesus had given his commission, that the gospel was to go from Jerusalem all the way to the uttermost parts of the earth. And it was a gospel that was enough, not the need to keep the ceremonial laws. So that was Paul's first missionary journey. In his second missionary journey, he went even further. So it was not just to this area where he was before, but now he went as far as Europe. If you recall, he wanted to go into Asia, but he was prevented from doing so. He wanted to go to Bithynia, but the Spirit prevented him, and he had a vision to go to Troas. And from here, right, in Troas, he received that vision to go over to Macedonia. And so he went first to Philippi, and the first Gentile convert there was Lydia. And he went all the way down here to Corinth, and it was at Corinth that he realized that the Jews, when they heard the gospel, they were continually hardened against it. They refused to listen. And this really should be no surprise, because if we follow the lessons on the life of Christ, as Jesus neared Jerusalem, he realized that it was the Jews that were resisting the gospel. And remember, when Jesus was about to go into Jerusalem from Bethany, he passed by the Garden of Gethsemane, where you have the Kidron Valley. And in the Kidron Valley, you have what two plants that grow in the valley? Olives and figs. And that is where, at that garden, very likely, this garden that was known by Judas Iscariot as well, which is why he brought the soldiers back there, Jesus cursed the fig tree. And he was continually, towards the end of his ministry, talking about, if you abide in me and I in you, you will bear forth fruit. But every branch that does not abide in me and bear forth fruit will be cut off. So these Jews had been connected by covenant, right, to God as his outward people. But here they were rejecting the gospel, left, right, center. Yes, the Jewish church was very strong in the beginning. Majority of Christians were Jews, but subsequently the Gentiles started to comprise of more of the Christians. And so it was at Corinth where, he said the words, I am going to the Gentiles. Now, this does not mean that Paul disregarded the Jews. He continued to minister wherever he went to the Jews, but his main priority was to minister the gospel to the Gentiles. Now, on the third missionary journey, Paul went and visited all the places that he had visited in his first and second missionary journey to strengthen the church, because he knew very well that he would be imprisoned. And it was here that he sent all the various apostolic men to be pastors of these various churches. And we see that these churches were really growing by this time. They were growing stronger in doctrine. They were also growing stronger in their good works, in the demonstration of the gospel. They were giving money and collecting for the poor saints who were in Jerusalem. And finally, what we learn is after he returned from his third missionary journey, he spent 2 years in Caesarea under imprisonment, first under Felix, then after Festus, and he had appealed to Caesar, right? And what the governors told Paul in the end was, you didn't have to appeal to Caesar, but because you appealed to Caesar, we have to send you to Caesar. You're innocent of all these false charges of the Jews. Now, why in the world did Paul appeal to Caesar? Because when he was arrested, before that, Agabus already had told him, right? And Jesus in a vision had already told him that Paul will be a witness not only in Jerusalem, but he will be a witness in Rome. So Paul, was going to go to Rome. He was going to the uttermost parts of the world. And, we as a church, we've just studied Acts, so we know the journey that he took was really treacherous, right? He sailed this way, and he got into a shipwreck at Malta, and finally they got to Rhegium and Puteoli, to API, to the Three Taverns, and eventually to Rome, where he ministered the gospel in Caesar's household, so much so that even the relatives, the household of Caesar, many of them became Christian, right? So the gospel was spreading, the Jews were rejecting, but the Gentiles, they were receiving. And so we want to see here, in the Acts of the Apostles, and we look at the context of the New Testament, how eventually Jerusalem was destroyed. The gospel was moving from Jerusalem to Judea, Samaria, to the uttermost parts of the earth. The Jews were rejecting what was their heritage. And so Jesus, as Jesus foretold, Jerusalem would be destroyed. Now, in studying the life of Christ, we saw his Olivet Discourse. He said there'll be wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, and great problems. And in the end, what would happen to Jerusalem is that its people will encounter great tribulation. So, as I said earlier on, in Acts 18, when Paul was in Corinth, when the Jews opposed him and they blasphemed, he shook his clothes and said, "Your blood be on your heads. Henceforth I will go into the Gentiles." And slowly we see that there's a shift from a Jewish Christian-centric church to a Gentile-centric Christian church. And the Jews that had converted, we learn in the Bible itself that slowly they also started to apostatize. One entire epistle was dedicated to writing to the Jews in Rome, the Jewish Christians in Rome, who were facing such great persecution that so many of them were thinking, it's better to abandon the faith, abandon Jesus. After all, I still worship the living and true God, right? I'll just go back to worshiping in the temple and offering sacrifices. And the writer to the Hebrews said, "Oh, if you give up Christ, you're giving up Jehovah, because Jesus is Jehovah." And what? You want to go back to the temple? Jesus is a better temple. You want to go back to the priest? Jesus is the great high priest that sat down on the throne after he finished all of his work. All these other priests, they have to work day and night, first day to seventh day, first day to seventh day. It never ends. You want to go back to that ceremonial temple kind of ideology, right? You're actually abandoning the faith if you're going to go back there. So he warned them. He said, it is impossible for those who know the gospel, right, who tasted how good it was, right? They never ate. They only tasted. They shared in the Holy Ghost. They never possessed the Holy Ghost. They only tasted the good word of God. They never ate the words of God, right? They only saw the powers of the world to come. They saw miracles. But if they fall away, if these who profess the true religion but who are not truly saved, right, these Jewish Christians in Rome, if they fall away, they will never be renewed again unto repentance. They can never truly be saved again. So this was the condition of the Jewish church. And the time the writer to the Hebrews wrote this was probably about 65 to 68 AD. And they were going through. The reason why they wanted to apostatize and go back to Judaism is because Nero, the Roman emperor, he did not persecute Jews, but he was very heavy-handed and he persecuted the Christians. And this was during the time of Nero. It was intense persecution. And so what happened is we see a parallel between the spiritual world, the kingdom of God, and people were apostatizing, the Jews. And we see this with the political kingdom, the earthly kingdom of Israel at that time. Now in 66 AD, right, during the time of Nero, there was a full-scale rebellion in Judea. So it so happened that one of the Gentiles was performing some Gentile purification or religious rite. The accounts are a bit confusing. Some say it was a sacrifice that was offered in front of a synagogue. Other people have written, like Josephus, it was pouring a pot of urine outside a synagogue. Well, the Jews, of course, they got so upset because their sight was defiled that they rioted. And during the riot, they shouted insults against the next governor of Judea, Florus, and he, in turn, killed a lot of people in a marketplace. And so from Judea, this rebellion spread all over Israel. Now, all of us are familiar with the historian Josephus. So Josephus was one of those who joined the rebellion, and he was eventually captured. When he was captured, he was later on, as a prisoner taken along, and as he went along, he recorded, he became a historian. And what he said was about this riot and the whole bloodshed, the conflict between the Jews and the Romans, was that there was an orgy of fire and bloodshed. So the Jews were experiencing a great massacre. And this should, in our minds, connect us with Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed because of the hardness of the hearts of the people. So in the end, in AD 70, Titus, who was the son of Vespasian, the emperor at that time, he destroyed the temple at Jerusalem. He looted the contents. So just as the writer of the Hebrews said, what good is the priest? It's fading away. Well, what's good about the sacrifices? That's version 1.0. You already have version 2, right? These things are fading away. They will be destroyed one day. And indeed, in AD 70, it did. All right? So as a result, because of the revolt, the temple destroyed, the Jews that were left in Judea, many of them, they left. Now, when we talk about Pentecost, you had Jews from all over the world who were coming. Those were the ones who had settled in other parts of the world because of the first exile, right? Under Babylon, they did not return back when Nehemiah and Ezra returned back, right? And this one was the second exile when the Romans came. They destroyed it. They laid bare. They razed to the ground Jerusalem, and the people now, they left. Right? And the Romans now named the land Palestine. So where does this term come from? We keep hearing on the news, the Palestinians, Palestine. Where does this word come from? It was the Romans who gave it to that area in AD 70 after the destructions. What better name to name Israel than to name it after the name of their ancient enemies, the Philistines, right? So they called it Palestine. Now this is a relief at the Arch of Titus. This is in Rome. So I just show it here, but not because we're seeing it, right? So Titus had this relief done in commemoration of his victory. And you see all the Romans carrying away the paraphernalia from the temple. And what do you see here? What is this? The golden lampstand, all right? This is the one that lit up the whole sanctuary inside the temple. So this was taken away, presumably broken down, melted, I don't know. All right? So Jerusalem was destroyed. But a small group of people called the Zealots. Now, who was a zealot? One of Jesus' disciples? Simon the Zealot. And he would have been in cahoots with who? That was spared and did not get crucified? Yeah, thank you very much. I want answers from everyone else. Right? Barabbas, right? And the two other thieves. So these were the zealots, right? And so what happened is they escaped to a place called Masada by the Dead Sea. That is where we're going to be going. It was a fortress that was constructed by the Hasmoneans, right? The Hasmoneans being Judas Maccabeus. If you remember your lesson on the Jewish kingdom, right? Right? So, and later, this was rebuilt by Herod the Great to be his own fortress. So during the Jewish revolt, the Zealots took over the fortress. And after the destruction of Jerusalem, many of the Jews, they took refuge there. They didn't want to go anywhere else. They only wanted to stay in the promised land. And this would be the last stronghold against the Romans. And so the Zealots, even though they were supposed to be nationalists, they were supposed to be for Israel, history records for us that when they were in Masada, right, one of the things that they did is they attacked a settlement near in En-Gedi, where we are also going. En-Gedi. What happened in En-Gedi? Who escaped to En-Gedi? Be quiet. David, yes. David, where he likely wrote Psalm 23, where the high cliffs, right? He had to go through the valley of the shadow of death. So anyway, there was a settlement there, and they killed 700 Jews. So were these loyalists? What were they, right? This is exactly what Jesus warned Peter about. My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, I would call down a legion of angels, right? So, this really tells us the great motivation for the Jews, because they had always wanted an earthly kingdom. They wanted to oust the Romans. This was their last stronghold. So when they went there and boarded themselves up, in AD 73, eventually Masada was destroyed by the Romans. They laid siege to this fortress. Now, the accounts are conflicting. Whether the zealots, they drank poison and killed themselves, whether they killed one another and the last one drank poison, or they allowed, after the siege, the Romans came in and massacred all of them. So when we visit the site, this is Masada. So does it have a biblical significance? Post what we see in the Bible, but it's part of biblical history, right? And it connects very importantly with the theology that's presented in the Gospels. My kingdom is not of this world, right? And furthermore, there will be destruction because the Jews rejected the gospel. So this is Masada. This is what we will see. So you see the big cliffs. I think there might be one group that attempts to walk up. You can be sure I'll not be part of that group, all right? So there's cable car that goes up, all right? But what we see is even when you look down from Masada to the Judean wilderness down below, you will see the remains of the Roman garrison. It took years for them to, get rid of the Jews that were there, and so they had to build a garrison, and even today we can see the ruins of it. And how did they make their way up to Masada to conquer it? Because Masada is in a high hill, and this one is at the bottom. Well, the way they did it was to build. A ramp. So from here, the settlement or the garrison, they built a ramp by laying rocks and sand all the way up until they got to Masada, and they fought the Jews. The Jews had their last stand here, and they eventually perished. So after the Jews were removed, what happened? Well, the Romans were still in control. And what we see is that Christians in the empire, and especially in Israel, they continued to be persecuted. I'll just go through some of these briefly. You have Nero, the one who killed Christians in Rome. Probably that's why you have the occasion of the book of Hebrews. Then during the reign of Vespasian, you have the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, from here, most of the Jews had left Israel. There were still some Christians there, but Christians were all over the place, right, as they left and as they were converted in the cities of their birth. Now, under the Emperor Domitian, John the Apostle was persecuted. He didn't die at his hands, right? He died of old age. During Trajan, he was most famous for gladiators, to have gladiators kill Christians. So I think it is, you have this martyr by the name of Perpetua. So Perpetua and all the other saints in the book, in the Fox's Book of Martyrs, some of them were, killed in the arenas during the reign of Trajan. Then, of course, you had Hadrian. Hadrian was very famous for his expansionist policies. It was under him that that Rome had its great expansion into Great Britain. Of course, there you have what that's called, right? Hadrian's Wall, right? And here he led his second campaign against the remaining Jews who were in Palestine, or what is now called Palestine. Then you have Marcus Aurelius, who is supposed to be the great Stoic emperor, right? Who brought the Pax Romana, the era of peace, but he was not actually very peaceful towards the Jews. Then you have some of these other emperors like Maximinus, where he exiled an early Christian leader by the name of Hippolytus. You have Decius, who increased emperor worship, Valerian, who persecuted Cyprian, right, an early church father. Then you have Diocletian, who massacred the most martyrs of his day. So why? It's just to tell you that during these 300 years, being a Christian was very difficult, and yet the church continued to grow. Then you come to Constantius, who destroyed Christian churches. And what is ironic about Constantius is his son was Constantine. And Constantine was the one who eventually made Christianity the legal religion, right, of the Roman Empire. So in 313, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which basically guaranteed religious freedom for Christians. So Christianity was now an approved religion of the Roman Empire. And subsequently, legend tells us that he was about to go to war. Was he about to go to war, Asaph? Yes. So, battle what? Milvian Bridge, okay. All right, so he was about to go into a time of a battle, and so he had a vision which he saw the words, "In this sign, the sign of the cross, you will conquer." And apparently through this, he converted, all right? And this is in 324 when he made Christianity not only legalized, but the main religion of the Roman Empire. And according to tradition, he was eventually baptized by Saint Eusebius of Nicomedia. And what is interesting in our context, as we're going to Israel, is his mother, who was very likely converted earlier, and some historians say, yeah, it's because of her conversion. That's why he had the Edict of Milan to issue tolerance. But he commissioned her to go to Palestine to identify the holy sites. What do you get with pagan practices mixed with Christian theology? You get syncretism. So the pagans were very well known for going to certain religious sites to worship there. Because why? Holy Ma. By the way, are we going to the Holy Land? Are we going to the Holy Land? No, there's no such thing as a holy land. Right? Only heaven is holy. Only the worship of God is holy. That's why we call it Bible Lanza. Huh? Okay? All right, so she went there, and she went around, and she searched up history and tradition, and she endorsed certain sites. So the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where we will also be visiting as one of the sites of Jesus' crucifixion, she's the one who had this place consecrated. She's the one who also looked at the location of the Via Dolorosa and said, oh, these are the 14 stations where Jesus stopped at. Then she's the one who at Galilee, chose and consecrated the site of the multiplication of the fish and loaves. That's Tabgha. And in Bethlehem, she was the one who essentially identified the shepherd's field, where the shepherds heard the singing of the angels, and also the Church of the Holy Nativity. So this is significant. When we go there, it'll be like, why are we going and seeing so many churches? Now, we're not going to obsess about the churches, the architecture, the iconography. The sites are not unimportant, but we also have to notice and to take note that it's based on certain traditions. In the end, it's not the exact site that matters to us, right? It's the learning process, what we can understand from these sites. So you have here the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And apparently this is Jesus' tomb, right, where his tomb would have been. So they have a shrine here, right? The interesting thing is when you go in there will be people who will be doing obeisance and reverence, will be kissing the slab. So there's a slab on which Jesus' body was supposed to have been laid in order to be prepared for burial, and then it will be put into this place. And so people, you will see, they will be kissing the slab. I don't recommend kissing it. This is the Church of the Holy Nativity, all right? And, you know, there are certain things which are interesting. And we see from this, there's a certain amount of accuracy, not the whole, elaborate display here. But when Jesus was born in a stable, remember we discussed this? What would it have been? Would it have been a barn made of wood? We discussed this earlier, right? Do you remember? What would it have been? Anyone? A cave. It would have been a cave. And so here you have an example how it is lower down, right, in a grotto, right? And of course, they've stylized it here. They put a star here, and pilgrims would come here to kiss, right? Are we pilgrims there? No, we're students. It's a Bible Lands tour. We're tourists. Okay? All right. So, now, so just a summary, okay? We see that there's rejection by Christ of the Jews. Therefore, the gospel and salvation goes to the Gentiles. There was a destruction of Jerusalem, the diaspora of the Jews, according to prophecy. Right? And then there was persecution of Christians. Even Jesus told his disciples, you will endure many things. Then there was eventually the conversion of Rome to Christianity. But what happened after that is the church was growing. You know, you could say Satan's tactic was to use persecution. And then thereafter, Satan's tactic was to use assimilation. Right? Paganism came into Christianity. Then Israel was now ruled by the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, a Christianesque empire, but filled with still a lot of superstitions. Now, I have to be very forthright. The early church, at its start, with the early church fathers, it was still biblical. But once you started to have this mass conversion, that's when you start to have the introduction of syncretistic and unbiblical but pagan ideas into Christianity. And that is why when we go to the churches there and we see some of them, we can see, look, they're no different from pagan temples that you have elsewhere. So Israel at this point in time was ruled by the Byzantine Empire, Christianesque. Pilgrims would come. The church, in that one sense, was growing. But subsequently, you have the Islamic conquest. All right? The Islamic conquest by first the Arabs and then thereafter the Turks. So in the year 637, and this is not too long after the founding of Islam. When was Islam founded? 622, when Muhammad went from Mecca to Medina, right? And of course, the month of Ramadan is supposed to commemorate this flight. So within how many years, the whole of Saudi Arabia had been conquered under the flag of Islam by the sword, and now the Arabs were moving up north, right, and to Syria and down south to Jerusalem, and they conquered Israel from the Byzantine Empire. And this is where the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, they were built. Now, you notice that the Al-Aqsa Mosque has been in the news recently, right? And I'll show you a bit of these things later. So after the temple was destroyed, you had the Temple Mount. So several hundred years later, the Muslims came and they built a shrine over the rock on which they believe Ibrahim was to have sacrificed Ishmael. Because in the Muslim theology, it's not Abraham sacrificing Isaac, but it's Ibrahim sacrificing Ishmael. All right? And so they built a shrine there to commemorate that. and that would become the third holiest site in Islam after the Kaaba in Mecca and the city of Medina. That's why you have Muslims who will go and pay homage at the Dome of the Rock. Now, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, so the Dome of the Rock is not a mosque, it is a shrine. Right? The Al-Aqsa Mosque is the mosque where they worship. And so there are pilgrimages which are made there. And this was built in the late 600s. Then after that, you have the Abbasid dynasty, also an Arab dynasty, right? So the caliphs, right? They were the kings, and during this dynasty, there was an increase of persecution of Christians. But in 970, the Seljuk Turks, they came and they conquered the Arabs. They became the new caliphate that would defend Islam, and they permitted limited Christian tolerance. But what happened during this time was there was a limit of the ability of pilgrimages, because Jerusalem was open for the Muslims to come, but it was not so open for the Christians to come. And in those days, because of their sacerdotal, sacramental theology, the more pilgrimages, holy sites you visit, the more holy you can become. And so as a result, there was war. All right, now before we get there, I'll just show you here. This is the Western Wall. This is the remaining part of the Second Temple that was built by Nehemiah and Ezra, Zerubbabel. This is the only remaining part. It was Herod that had increased it and renovated this entire Temple Mount. But when Titus came, this was destroyed. The whole grounds was destroyed. Then came the Umayyad dynasty. The Arabs, they came, and they built this Dome of the Rock here and the Al-Aqsa Mosque here. There are some interesting things. I want to tie you back to the things that we learned before. Remember, we said, where was the Holy of Holies? It was not here. So when we go to Jerusalem and when we visit, oh, so sad, a shrine now stands over where the temple was. This is the common sentiment that many people have. Does it bother us? Doesn't bother us at all, right? Because we are the temple of God, right? We don't need a third temple. But the actual place of the Holy of Holies would have been in line with the Golden Gate Bridge, which was right here. So the temple would have been here, not here. And we will see this Dome of the Tabrets here. Is it this one or this one? Oh, no, it's this one. This one, is it? Yeah, well, we'll get there. We will see it. So this would have lined up with the Golden Gate, of the temple. Now, this mosque here is ancient. It had been rebuilt. But you see here, this is at the southern steps. You can't see in this picture, but on one of the days, we'll be visiting the southern steps. This is where the pilgrims would go up. They would sing the Song of Ascent, the Song of Degrees, like Psalm 121 all the way to, Psalm 136. So they would sing all of these songs there. But you do not want to be here on a Friday, because this is where they have their services in the mosque. This is where they stir up the people. The recent thing, I think it was a Friday, was it? All right. So they barricaded themselves against the Muslim authorities. And on a Friday, you don't want to be here because they throw rocks out. Right? Don't worry, we're not going to be there on a Friday anyway. All right. So, what's my point? Just essentially say this was built during the Umayyad time, right? This is why there is such hostility today. And as we go through the history, we will also see some of these things. Now, because of the reduction of pilgrimages by Christians, what happened is, because of the Carolingian Empire, Charlemagne, Charles Martel, they formed crusades through the Pope in Avignon, All right? At that point in time, there was a pope in Rome, there's a pope in Avignon. All right? And so it was a pope in Avignon that said, we have to take back Jerusalem, the Holy Land, right, for the Christians. And so the nation of the Franks, they conquered, they secured pilgrimage sites, they even built new ones. And for a time in Israel, it was ruled by the Crusaders. And what was interesting is they committed a lot of atrocities against the Jews, the local Christians, as well as the Muslims. That's why the Crusades today are used by Muslims to show the atrocities of Christians, right? And that's why there's a certain group no longer called Crusade, right? A campus ministry because of this kind of association, right? So they built churches. We'll take a look at one. We will be visiting one as well. After the Crusaders, you had the Mamluk rule, and thereafter the Ottoman rule, which was the Turks, also from Istanbul. And it was during this time where, and this is interesting, in the UK, among the Plymouth Brethren, J.N. Darby was teaching something new from the Bible, saying, and it was not exactly new, but saying that there will be a kingdom in Israel again. The Jews will return. They will set up a modern kingdom, and Christ will rule from there. And one day there will even be a temple that will be rebuilt, and sacrifices will be reinstituted. And that is how they read the Old Testament, which is why even today, among the majority of Christians, this school of thought, this theology, has so influenced them that even in Israel today, people will make pilgrimages there. They're very much for the support of the Jewish state. They support Israel as a nation. And you are marrying the spiritual kingdom of God with a political kingdom, something that Jesus himself said, my kingdom is not of this world, right? So this was being taught, and there was opportunity during this time where Jews were returning to Israel to set up Jewish communes. They came mostly from Russia and Poland, and a Zionist conference, this idea that we must return back to Israel, was championed by Theodor Herzl. Now, I'm not going to be teaching this here. It's a bit too complicated, but there's a historical significance between the dispensationalists and Theodor Herzl, that they were influencing him. So I can give you the videos to watch if you want to. But anyway, but what's interesting is he revived the Hebrew language. The Hebrew language for almost 2,000 years was no longer spoken, right? It was spoken in liturgy when they would read the Torah, but aside from that, no one really spoke it. Now, when the Jews went to Germany and to Russia, they developed a hybrid language called Yiddish, which was part Jewish, part Hebrew, and part German. But Hebrew as a language was dead. Well, Theodor Herzl was the one who revived it. He would speak Hebrew. He came up with the syntax, came up with the grammar as he saw in the Hebrew Bible, and he taught his children. And so much so, there was a movement to learn this language. So it is effectively one of the only few languages that was dead, but now alive, right? And everyone speaks it in Israel. And in 1909, there was the first kibbutz. So a lot of these who were returning, they were returning from Russia, Poland, Germany. They were Jews who were influenced by Karl Marx. And so they wanted to build a nation of equality because in the other countries that they were in, they were unequal with the rest of the people. So they wanted to have a communist commune. And so many of the first ones who returned were communistic. They built communes. I think we'll be eating one day at a kibbutz. Possibly, right? Yeah. So we'll be visiting some of these kibbutz. Now, this is the Church of St. Anne in Jerusalem. It has one of the world's best acoustics. So if you like to sing, we should all sing in that church. It's wonderful. But the main point is this. This is a Crusader architecture. It was built in the 1100s, right? And it is a testament that the Crusades, the Crusaders, this European group of people were ruling Israel for about 100 or so years. Now, very quickly, the Ottoman Empire ended after World War I when they lost. They were part of the they were part of the other side, the dark side. Okay, and so they lost that war. All right, and so the British took over Palestine. And it was during this time that the foreign minister, he pledged to support the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. And this is when Jews from Europe, they continued to return back to Israel. And Britain actually granted a mandate called the Mandate for Palestine, and it was it was something ratified also by the League of Nations, which was the precursor of the United Nations. And they said, okay, there should be a historic land for the Jews. And so Palestine, which Britain was ruling, they split it up into Transjordan and Cisjordan. So today we have Jordan and Israel, right? We'll be landing in Jordan, Amman. So back in those days, it was one country. It was called Palestine. But the British, suka, they just split the land. It's kind of like one day it was India. Then the next day it is India and East and West Pakistan, right? So that's what happened. And so you can imagine the kind of anger that the Jordanians or the Arabs had. This was once our land. It's no longer our land. And so 3/4 would remain part of Transjordan, which is Jordan today. It would be for the Arabs, and 1/4 of this land will be on the other side, on the western side of the Jordan River, and this would be for the Jewish national home. And this is basically where Israel is today. So this was done in the early 1900s, but in 1941, or 39, however you want to count it, right, the Holocaust started where the Jews were decimated in Europe, which is why there was a great desire to see what was planned before by the League of Nations, now the United Nations, to see it through to have a Jewish state. And so now the UN proposed the establishment of Arab and Jewish states in Palestine, namely Jordan, the king of Jordan, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, as well as Israel. So when the British, they exited in 1948, the state of Israel was proclaimed, and immediately the next day, a coalition of 5 Arab states attacked Israel. So what happened is Jerusalem was captured. So even though it was on the other side, Cisjordan, it was captured. But Israel happened to capture the south, the Negev. And what happened is the Arabs in both of these countries were kind of displaced. They were part of Palestine. They were now displaced. Now, is it the fault of Israel? Some will say, if there's no war, then no problem. Some will say, if you didn't declare the land, there would be no problem. But these Arabs, the Palestinians, historically speaking, and I'm hoping I'm speaking fairly, they were not wanted by Syria. They were not wanted by Jordan. They were not wanted by Saudi Arabia. So you have these people who did not want to be part of Israel, but no other country would accept them. Right? And unfortunately, they're being used as pawns today in this whole conflict in the Middle East. And usually the ideology is, Israel is so bad, they do all of these things to these people. But the Arabs are the ones who are saying, these are our people. Why are they not taking them in? Anyway, all right, so Jerusalem was captured, but in 1967, in the Six-Day War, when Syria, Egypt, and Jordan attacked, in the span of this 6 days, Israel drove back Syria past the Golan Heights. So not only did these countries, they were not able to gain land and oust Israel, they were repulsed further. So Israel gained control back of the West Bank and Jerusalem, which they didn't have before. They gained control of the Suez Canal as well as the Sinai Peninsula, where the fake Mount Sinai is. Fake or real, you decide, right? Then, it was able to capture Gaza from the Egyptians. And so what happened is a treaty had to be signed. These countries were, Julian, right? They were shamed, right? They had tried to do this, but they were repulsed back. So eventually, after the Yom Kippur War, Israel signed a treaty and returned back Sinai to Egypt. And Egypt, in turn, recognized Israel's right to exist. Same thing with Jordan, right? And that's why when we cross the border, so you might be wondering, why is there such tension there? Because they're fighting over historic land rights. And so we need to understand the sensitivities when we go there. Especially when we go into Bethlehem, to the West Bank, please don't gay kiang and say shalom. Please just say salam, okay? So I think these are important things to understand, the sensitivities because of that. Now, before I get into some of this, we have to end soon. There was a rabbi who once said, more Jews are being converted today in the last 20 years than all the past 20 centuries combined. So it is a wonderful thing to know that the gospel, where once the eyes of the Jews were closed, their hearts were hardened, that the gospel went to the Gentiles, that in recent years, the Jews have been embracing the gospel and turning to Christ. The church that we're visiting, this late pastor, his name is Anthony Simon. He was a Brit. He was an atheist. One day he decided to go to Israel to join a kibbutz just for fun because he was a Jew. He went there and his roommate, who was a Christian, shared the gospel to him. And he read Isaiah 53 to him. And this friend of mine said, don't read me Christian stuff. Then when he finally realized it was from the Old Testament, that's when his eyes opened. And he converted. He returned back to the UK. He joined Brynterian Seminary. So I'm not, that's in Wales, right? Evangelical Theological College of Wales, it used to be called. Then it was called Wales Evangelical School of Theology. Then it's called something else today. For those of you who are interested, Michael Reeves is the principal of the school. So he joined that school, and that's where he met the late Thomas Chong, and that's where he subsequently returned back. He started this witness, and the gospel has been going forth consistently. And Jews are coming to be saved. Just another piece of information, this group was associated with Heart Cry Missions. That's Paul Washer's group. And so when Paul Washer would often come over to Israel, and they would go out street evangelism, Anthony Simon would often push him in front of Orthodox Jews to share the gospel with them. So what I'm trying to say, it's a wonderful thing that's happening in the land. But the question that comes before us, perhaps out of interest as Reformed Christians going to Israel, is this: is this modern state of Israel foretold in the Bible? All right? Now, the reason why I'm saying it here is not that we want to discuss anything definitive, but when we go there through guides who will be saying, through certain things that we will be looking at, some of these thoughts will be introduced. There will be other tour guides, especially on Tel Megiddo when we're there. You'll have a guide or pastor there who may point, the Russians are coming from over that hill during the last war, and the Chinese will come from over that hill. So, these are things that we have to be cognizant of and to develop a conviction about. Now, some of the things that people point to, especially the dispensationalists, they will say, yeah, Israel is foretold. The modern state of Israel is foretold because God will take them from the heathen, gather them out of all the countries, bring them into their own land. Where once they were a valley of dry bones, God will breathe into them, then muscle, sinew, skin, breath will come together, and this Israel which was once a valley of dry bones, they will come and be living again. And according to the prophecy, God said to Ezekiel, the prophet, "These bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried, and our hope is lost. We are cut off for our parts." But now they've come together and become part of this new state. So some people will say modern Israel is foretold in the Bible. But let us take a look at a Reformed perspective. We see that there in the Bible, hardly a difference in terms of the terminology that is used to describe Israel and the words that are used to describe the church. All right? We see here in these verses, God calls Israel saints. But in the New Testament, he calls the church saints. In the Old Testament, in these passages, Israel is called the elect. But in the New Testament, in these verses, the church is called the elect. In Deuteronomy 7 and 4, Israel is denoted as the beloved. But here in the New Testament, the church is called the beloved. Is there a difference? Furthermore, God calls Israel the called in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, the same word is used to describe the church, the people of God, right? Neither Jew nor Greek. Then in these passages in the Old Testament, Israel is called the flock, but in these passages in the New Testament, the church, God's people, are called the flock. Similarly, in Exodus 19, Israel is called a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, a royal priesthood, and a chosen generation, a peculiar treasure. But in the same way, in 1 Peter 2, the church is called a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. All right? Furthermore, Israel in the Old Testament was called holy, but in the New Testament, the church is called holy. In the Old Testament, God says he will tabernacle and dwell with Israel, but when Jesus came, he was said to have been made flesh and dwelt or tabernacled with us. Furthermore, in the Old Testament, God or Jehovah is married to Israel, but in the New Testament, Christ is betrothed to the church. So is there a difference? Some people will say, is Jehovah marry Israel? This one is Christ is betrothed to the church. You can only make that distinction if you don't believe that Christ is Jehovah. Right? So the whole point here is that when we go, let's have some theological basis as we see the land, as we appreciate the land. Now, this does not therefore mean there is no burden for the old covenant people of God. God is the one who saves both Jews and Greeks and Gentiles, right? And the church of God is one. And we see here, even in historic Reformed understanding, even in the Westminster Directory of Public Worship, in the prayer before the sermon, the minister is supposed to, after reading of the word, right, the minister who is to preach, he is to pray for the propagation of the gospel and kingdom of Christ to all nations, for the conversion of the Jews, the fullness of the Gentiles, etc. And so, as we go, it is not simply a tour. It is not simply look-see and learn the Bible. I hope that as we go, there will be a burden as we meet the Christians there. God willing, we will also meet some Christians in Bethlehem. I'm trying to arrange that. I'm not sure whether we'll have time, but we will certainly meet with our Reformed brethren in Jerusalem. It's an opportunity for us to witness Christ, to be exemplary, to see what God has done in that nation with the proliferation of churches there. But I just wanted to end by showing this to you. Very interesting. Wilhelmus Abrakel from the Nadere Reformatie, right? A Puritan of the Dutch Reformed Church. Interestingly, he said this. I'm not sure what to make of it, but I think it's good for us as we learn. It is a Bible study tour. just to consider some of these things where he said, and this is when he wrote this in the 1700s, even before J.N. Darby. Will the Jewish nation be gathered together again from all the regions of the world and from all the nations of the earth among which they have been dispersed? Will they come to dwell in Canaan and all the lands promised to Abraham, and will Jerusalem be rebuilt? We believe, okay, he believes that, okay, all right, that these events will transpire. We deny, however, that the temple will be rebuilt and that the previous mode of worship will be observed. So no more sacrifices, no more temple, which prior to Christ's coming was of a typifying nature and would then be of a reflective nature. They will be an independent republic governed by a very wise, good-natured, and superb government. Furthermore, Canaan will be extraordinarily fruitful. The inhabitants will be eminently godly, and they will constitute a segment of the glorious state of the church during the 1,000 years prophesied in Revelation 20. Now, what a wonderful thing indeed if that is what is happening. Whatever it is, God's old covenant people are coming to faith, and that is something that we can be grateful for, especially when we visit the land. All right, I'm going to end here. Are there any questions?